In the movie Fight Club, there is not a single scene in the entire movie that does not have a cup of Starbucks coffee in it. Some are obvious, some not so much, but they're in there. Now, you may not have been consciously perceiving it, but our subconscious perceived every single one. And Starbucks was completely fine with this because they didn't have to pay for the subliminal messaging. But is this really what we could call subliminal messaging? Let's look a little deeper. We really have to look at the two different definitions of subliminal messaging in our modern society. There's the old definition, something that affects us subconsciously, and we perceive subconsciously, and it affects our behavior. And then there's the new definition, a definition that means that it affects us subconsciously and we perceive it subconsciously, but it doesn't change our behavior or give us desires or wants. The first definition was the believed principle for a very long time. The ancient Greeks were really the ones who created it. When they created the idea of debate, they created small things, words, that they could insert into their speeches that could cause emotional responses. Subliminal messaging, the earliest form of it. But this kind of subliminal messaging has appeared everywhere in several different cases. One such situation was in the 1950s. A man who owned a movie theater inserted a 1/2000th of a second film that said, "Buy Coca-Cola and buy popcorn." In films where he showed that one scene, he saw a 50% increase in the sales of popcorn and a 20% increase in the sales of Coca-Cola. Although there might have been some faulty recording with the experimental data, so we don't really know whether or not this experiment is true. And that's really the situation with every single experiment on subliminal messaging that we've seen. An experiment says this is what happens, and then when we experiment on it again, we don't see the same results. The second type of subliminal messaging is a much more modern meaning. It's little hidden images that we see, but they don't necessarily affect our behavior. Such an example would be the Pizza Planet trucks in the Disney Pixar movies. In every single one, but are they putting them in there to change our behavior? I don't think so. The unfortunate thing about this meaning is that people can see things when they aren't really there. An example of this is the logo for Coca-Cola, which an artist representation sees as a man snorting cocaine off of his finger. Our first meaning is actually starting to take a turn towards something called subliminal persuasion instead of subliminal messaging, because it more relies on our senses to persuade us into desiring something, such as smell, sound, taste, touch, sight. An example of smell would be movie theaters using a buttery smelling air freshener that really wants you to have some popcorn. And hearing, although a little bit more detectable, still counts as subliminal persuasion. Like if I'm talking about cake, and I happen to mention that it's luscious, delectable, melt in your mouth, chances are you're getting a little hungry for some cake. Link to some examples of subliminal messaging are in the links below. Now, we need to talk about something a little more controversial. Sex sells. Well, it's not actually sex sells, it's sexy sells. We are constantly looking for products that make us feel more attractive. And our most vulnerable denomination being our nation's youth and our teenagers are extremely vulnerable to this, giving into pressure from peers, parents, and popular media to make them perfect, when everything from Hardee's to M&M's are using the sexy image to sell their products. It strongly affects our teenagers, but is it also making them addicted? Product loyalty is something that begins very early on. We start with our vulnerable groups, our teenagers, our youth, and they feel the need to buy these attractive products, so they become loyal to these attractive products. and then they become addicted to these products. Addiction is an unbearable attraction to an action or substance. Yes, you can be addicted to alcohol, drugs, gambling, but you can also be addicted to something like Cheetos. But why? Well, first of all, eating releases dopamine. And along the lines of Cheetos, the protein in cheese being casein actually releases dopamine, and is similar to the effect of morphine. So, yes, cheese is crack. I'm just gonna let that soak in for a second. And you know, when you're listening to really great music and you get those goosebumps, well, that's caused by a really, really fast and sudden release of dopamine to the brain. Yes, dopamine is released through cocaine. So basically, drugs are replacing the things in our lives that create happiness. Well, then why is it that intelligent people are more likely to be addicted to drugs than somebody who's stupid? You would expect intelligent people to be able to enjoy things like good music, art, things like that. But perhaps that question is better geared towards Thomas Gray, because you know, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. Several million people in America alone are addicted to smoking, drinking, heroin, and cocaine. But when we can get these same kind of hormones from eating cheese, why don't we? Well, heroin and cocaine release the dopamine to the brain in such a large quantity and so quickly that it makes us high. Eating cheese, although releasing a similar feeling, doesn't do it so quickly in such a large quantity. So we become addicted to the quantity and the speed at which these drugs release it to our brain, and we end up needing it to be happy. Everything we see, smell, touch, taste, hear affects our desires. But perhaps it's overcoming these desires that keep us from addictions. But in the end, we're all addicts, whether it's to, ironically, Breaking Bad, or cheese, or heroin. We all have a vice. And maybe yours should be scienced. Thank you.